take it
Yeah,
away.
so I'm so happy to see so many people here, some familiar faces, and some of you I'm sure who this is your first Drupal event. Just to give me an idea, how you want to how do we do this? Do we raise our hands in Zoom?
There's the reactions button down in the bottom,
Do
so you
we
can.
react? Before I share my screen, I want to see people. Who's here for the first time?
Hey,
In the
we got a
chat.
handful.
Hello? Yes, great, awesome.
Nice.
I think this event is like the perfect thing to kick off, like doing your first Drupal event and kind of getting familiar, getting comfortable. I know Margaret went through some content about what Drupal is. And now I want to dig a bit deeper and talk a bit about how you can start to use Drupal, some use cases, and also kind of how you can take those next steps to learn more and actually participate in the community. So oftentimes with Drupal, we hear about what is Drupal and we start describing what Drupal does as if it's like just a software like any other. And, there's a list of features, there's the things that you can do with Drupal out of the box. And you're likely here because you are curious about maybe launching a new career in web development, or maybe you have a specific project and you're really interested in digging into Drupal, the software. But it's also important to know that Drupal is a community, and you hear that again and again, like Drupal, the Drupal community, stay for the community, all these things. But it's a little bit hard to put your finger on what is that community when you're first getting started. And also because if you're learning other types of software, you don't hear about this community thing. So how is that relevant, and like how is that actually going to help you get your project done or learn this new skill? So I'm kind of here today to help you fill in those gaps. And I also want to talk a little bit about actually some projects that you could do with Drupal just to help you dream a little bit and imagine. So first, I kind of want to think back for myself about how I got into Drupal, and maybe this will kind of help you think about your own path, because there's many different user journeys through the Drupal world. I first started learning Drupal because I was trying to build websites for clients. I had a really tiny web agency. It was basically just me and my husband. We had just started this company, and we were trying to plan, okay, how are we going to build everything our clients are asking for? They're coming to us asking for websites in English and French. They're coming to us asking us for this was back 15 years ago. So like, we want RSS feeds for our blogs, and like they wanted these features, and we were trying to figure out like what's the best way for us to work. So we know some things about the web, like we know some HTML, we know CSS, we know PHP, but like what's the best way to work? So we were experimenting, we were trying WordPress, we were trying Ruby on Rails, which is another platform. And then we stumbled across Drupal because one of our clients had actually suggested it to us. So my first experience with Drupal might be similar to yours. I hear about this software and I go onto Drupal.org and I try and download it and installing it for the first time. And I gave up. So my first experience with Drupal was like, oh, well, I can't figure this out. I'm going to go back and try something that I know. And then I revisited it again because we really needed to figure out a better solution for multilingual websites, and that kind of pushed me to dig a little bit deeper. And then I started to go to Drupal meetups where I was able to ask questions. And the first questions I was always asking were things like I'm sure Margaret talked to you a little bit about modules and what modules are, right? So my first questions were always like, is there like, what module should I use for this? Or like, is this module good? Should I download it? And so I always had those questions, or even just simple questions like, is this possible? And the answer is often yes, but it's always yes and. So can we make this thing translatable in Drupal? Yes, but like, here's the caveat, here's the trick that you need to know. So my journey was very much, you know, learning Drupal by trial and error, and really going to those meetups and asking lots of questions. So now, you know, so many years later, there's lots of resources out there for you when you're learning, and I'm going to point you to some of those today. So I start off with this question. So why Drupal? So this is kind of my reason for why I use Drupal. I like using Drupal because it's a great platform. You know, you're going to be learning what it does and the feature set and all of those specific ins and outs. It's a great platform, but it's actually a platform that kind of, it's got this community around it that kind of anticipates things that you're going to need. So sometimes Drupal gives you a feature before you even realize that you need it. And that's really why I love using Drupal. So I don't have time to know like everything that's coming down the road with API first architecture and you know, personalization features and all these buzzwords that people are talking about. But I know that like there's strength in numbers, and just the fact that so many people are thinking about Drupal and using it means that often, you know, when I'm trying to build something with a website that I'm working on, there's other people who are already facing that challenge because somebody asked them for that feature, and there's already people working on it. And that being said, that comes because there's this global community. So people around the world facing lots of different challenges, and everyone's surfacing that and often bringing it back in to make Drupal better. So I wanted to start off with a few kind of case studies just to inspire, because I think that's something that's kind of fun to spend some time thinking about, is just how different types of organizations are using Drupal. Starting off with NASA, because I think this is one of the most globally admired brands. But NASA is using Drupal for many different types of needs at the agency. You'll see this often, that sometimes a seed is planted, you know, at a big organization, that somebody uses Drupal for one project, and then the kind of strength of that is discovered and people start using it everywhere. So this kind of drop gets placed, and then Drupal expertise is kind of built up. And one of the things about running a really big project, because NASA's good at these big projects where they're organizing lots of teams and lots of people, is that for NASA, there's many different Drupal websites. And so they actually have 250 content editors who are logging in and updating information. And that's everything from like the research that NASA is bringing in to, you know, for information about specific events or specific science that they're running. So like there's all kinds of operations things that NASA does, and they have websites for a lot of their specific units. So that's a really common use case for Drupal in the government, and so they have lots of projects on the go. Another example is Arsenal. I think this is a well-known football club, or soccer. So one thing that I love about looking at these Drupal case studies is that they come in from around the world. So often we kind of in North America think about our government agencies and our universities, but it's really fun to also imagine that there's people in so many different countries, and they're all using Drupal for these big projects that are really important to them. I'll skip this one. Drupal is often used a lot in healthcare, actually. It's one of the most popular applications. So, you know, in the US and certainly in Canada, like there's a lot of big health institutions like hospitals that are responsible for putting out information for users. And these days that experience of like going to a hospital website or going to your healthcare provider for information is more and more important for people. And I think that one of the ways that Drupal is really exciting in this domain is that you can really count on Drupal. Like it has a really good secure reputation in terms of security. So if you're using Drupal to manage your data, you have a lot of control over that information. So the this particular example is from MU Healthcare. The University of Missouri School of Medicine is associated with this organization. So again, they have a lot of different ways that they use their website. And I'm going to mention, because we can kind of see here from the slides that there's these very visual landing pages on this website. And one of the things that we use Drupal more and more for now is not just kind of templated information, but more visual dynamic content. So that's one of the things that you might be hearing about at MidCamp this week, is kind of those applications of like building a great user experience with Drupal and really providing a lot of like customer service through a website. Okay, I'm going to skip through some other examples. We always love to look at the big names like the Weather Channel, but there's also lots of smaller organizations and nonprofits using Drupal. So historically, that's been a huge audience for Drupal websites. Just the whole value of open source and sharing information, I think that really strikes a chord with a lot of organizations that have that are kind of human-centric. So we in Drupal, like we like to put users at the center of an experience. We're building a great user experience. Obviously, that's also kind of rings true for these nonprofit organizations. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful when I work with clients is that often a client will start off with like a kind of, they just want to launch something. Like they just want a minimum viable product. They want a website that works well and looks good, but you want to get something done quickly and efficiently. And especially for nonprofits, you want something done cheaply, right? You have a budget limitation for sure. And so often for nonprofits, you might be able to get up and running really quickly with Drupal, but at the same time have that flexibility that like, okay, we'll build something now, and then in the future, we know we can add all these other features and integrations. And I think that that's really reassuring for a lot of organizations. And sometimes yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to interrupt. It looks like your presenter window is showing on top of your slides.
Oh no, okay, sorry. I should have double checked that.
Cool.
Yeah. So so if you happen to be working with a nonprofit organization, you can always know that you have that flexibility in the future, and that's one way of working. Just another thing to talk about is, part of this presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit about the roles that different people have working on Drupal projects. So I find just from meeting a lot of people in the Drupal community that there are lots of folks who are using Drupal who actually work for an organization like a nonprofit or like a university or a healthcare organization. And sometimes you have this type of really broad catch-all role where it's like, oh, this organization has a Drupal person. So that's a really common role to have, like Drupal generalists who just know a lot about all the different modules to use, all the different features to take advantage of. And they also know some coding, and they're able to dig in and do a lot of different things. And then sometimes people working in Drupal have more specific roles because they're working at an agency where there's a specialist in front end or back end, or performance optimization or security, and people have more specialties. So that's something you can also think about, like what is your role, and maybe connecting with people who have a similar role at an organization is helpful. So like I have lots of these case studies that I could share, and I just love the fact that there's so many impressive organizations using Drupal, but I'm not going to spend too much more time on this. I'll for sure make these slides available so you can flip through later. And on Drupal.org, there are also lots of other case studies so you can get inspired. And oftentimes when I'm looking at these case studies, I love to see kind of, well, why Drupal was chosen is always nice, just to kind of get a sense of how people are using Drupal and thinking about it. But also often these case studies on Drupal.org, they are actually going to tell you what modules they've used. People are really open often about sharing how they worked on a project. And so it can be a good way to learn and kind of get a sense of what other people out there are doing. So if you're just launching into your first project, maybe try and find a case study about a similar project, and that could be a good entryway for you to learning more. And another thing I love about these case studies is often the organization that's used Drupal, even if they've hired an agency, they get really invested in Drupal itself and really value that community value add. So with all that said, I'm just going to launch into the section about actually the community itself, and maybe sort of pinpoint a little bit more like, what does this mean open source? What does this mean community? So first and foremost, Drupal as a software is open source, meaning it's free to download and install it and use it. So that's kind of number one for a lot of people, is just, you know, you don't have to pay a licensing fee, and there's value in that. But it's also, open source also has this greater meaning that you can take that code and you can own it and you can do what you want with it. And that's really important for people, because if you're using some kind of other platform, you might be really locked in and not able to change things and not able to adapt. And you'll never know if in the future something is going to, if you're going to be able to own it. So just the fact that you can go and actually open up the Drupal code and change anything you want is really valuable. Now that said, there's a way to use Drupal and there's a way to extend it, and there's like lots of best practices about it. But just before we get into all those details, just knowing that you have the power to just open up the code and see everything that you have, there's a huge value in that. Now within Drupal, so Drupal, as Margaret was describing, there's this core that you get when you download Drupal, and then you can add on modules and you can do more and more with it. And actually the fact that Drupal's open source means that all of those add-ons that you have, like anything you download that you add on to Drupal, is also open source. So it tends to be with Drupal that all these add-ons, all these extra modules are also freely available. And that's obviously really powerful too. It means that people tend to use the same kinds of solutions, like, oh, I want to add a commerce feature. Well, we're probably all going to go to the same commerce module to get that. And that means that people build the same kind of expertise, and it means there's lots of people out there who could help you. It also means, like the fact that Drupal is open source also means that you can go in and maybe even as a non-technical user, if you're getting started, and take advantage of these modules. And you can also, of course, as a non-technical user, you can add and update the content, and it's really designed to work that way. And there's a community. So when we talk about community, oftentimes we're talking about the community of developers, the people who are writing code for Drupal and improving that software. But we are also talking about all the other people who work on the other aspects of Drupal, like adding translations, working on the marketing of Drupal, the people who are improving the user experience or checking to make sure that it's an accessible platform. So when you go in this photo up here on the screen, if you're looking at the screen, up top, this is from a DrupalCon, and DrupalCon is this huge event coming up there's a virtual one coming up next month, and you go there and you meet people who are using Drupal in all kinds of ways and contributing to Drupal in all kinds of ways. So definitely you'll find people who have contributed in ways that you didn't even realize were possible. But basically every aspect of Drupal was built by somebody. And a lot of that just comes from this huge community. Yeah, so getting into the details of that a little bit, like who's actually part of the Drupal community. So it's really everybody who's using Drupal is part of that community. So it's not like there's this high barrier to entry or like, oh, you have to do X, Y, and Z to be in the community. No, like just being here today means you're part of the Drupal community, downloading it and using it, having an account on Drupal.org. Like these are all kind of ways of participating. So there's many more than 1 million websites and more than 1 million people using Drupal around the world. There's lots of people who come to DrupalCon every year who participate a bit, a little bit more actively because you're attending, you're part of the conversation. And there's a DrupalCon usually in North America and Europe every year. At the moment, of course, these are virtual events. And then there's also lots, like hundreds of events like this that happen every year around the world. And pretty much everyone in the world is using Drupal, even if they're not actually going and installing it, they're using it because we've all visited Drupal websites without even realizing that we're on a Drupal website. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the areas where Drupal talent is kind of needed. So I mentioned that the Drupal community is this big thing because it's not just the developers writing code, it's all the work that goes into the platform. So, the design work, the user experience work, the user experience of actually editing Drupal. This is something that's been built on and improved. Copywriting, because there's lots of documentation about Drupal and help text in the back end of Drupal that people are working on. And then sales and marketing, like I run the Promote Drupal initiative, which is trying to create more marketing materials around Drupal and just helping educate people and get them onboarded so that they can start learning. And that being said, in all of these areas, you have people contributing to Drupal, and you have because people who contribute to Drupal tend to have jobs in Drupal. So there's a lot of areas of expertise, like on my team, everyone has some Drupal expertise. There's people who are more on the content strategy side, but it's still important that they understand how Drupal works. And so building that expertise, regardless of your role, is really valuable. And I would suggest a few places to go to get started in your learning. So beyond what you're learning today, there's the Drupal Slack. So if you have not joined the Drupal Slack, I really recommend that you join. There's a quick link here. It's just drupal.org/join-slack. And that just gives you the invite so you can get started right away and add that Drupal Slack. If you're already using Slack, it's kind of an easy way to just get plugged into the community. There's a lot of channels there, so you can get a little bit lost when you're starting, but for sure, if you just have some quick questions about, like what I was saying earlier, like not sure how to implement some feature, the support channel is a great place to get started. You can also subscribe to the weekly drop, which is a newsletter that goes out every week, obviously, and it has kind of some highlights about what's going on in Drupal. So you'll hear about new modules that are coming out, new tutorials, for sure, like events in the community are announced there, and job postings and things like that. So it's just a good way to start getting that information if you want to start digging a little bit in. There's also a Drupal user guide on Drupal.org that I recommend. The documentation team has really been trying to revamp the documentation and making it more user-friendly. So that's a good place to go. And then if you haven't installed Drupal yet, if you're really just at the very outset and you haven't done that kind of setting yourself up, there's really easy ways now to install Drupal in the cloud so that you don't have to necessarily go through installing everything on your laptop. So like me, I gave up, I told you, when I first started to use Drupal the first time. But if you go to that link, you can try Drupal in the cloud, and I don't think you're going to get stuck. It's pretty straightforward to install Drupal that way. And when you're doing that, one just little piece of advice I would give you is there's this project in Drupal called the Out of the Box initiative. And the reason that this exists is because it is a little bit overwhelming when you first install Drupal, because there's so many modules you could install, and there's like a lot of configuration to do, and it's kind of like this, people compare it to a Lego set that you could use it to build anything. And if you're one of those people that, you like to build the Lego set from scratch, just like starting piece by piece, then you can just install Drupal as normal. But if you want to start with something like I had this Lego set where there was like a castle, like the base of a castle to start with, and then you would just build up the walls. So if you want something more like that, and you want to just see what Drupal looks like already functioning as a website, there's this way when you install Drupal. There's like the first step, you pick the language, and the second step you pick the install profile, and there's an option called Umami. So if you just look for that when you're installing Drupal, if you pick that option, you will have like a Drupal website that actually does stuff. So it's a recipe website. And that can be a really good way to learn, because if you're like me, like how I like to learn is to really get my hands dirty, like trying stuff. And yet starting with a completely blank slate is also intimidating. So this allows you to try stuff, and you can go in and break everything, but you can also see that there's already content there. So I really recommend that. And then there's some more links here just to more resources of Drupal kind of conversations to get you started. So planning your first Drupal project, talk a little bit about this, just to give you a sense of those roles and like because you all might be playing different parts in a Drupal project. I'm sure some of you are developers and programmers, maybe you have that background. Some of you might be more on the project management side, or maybe you're more like overseeing a project or doing design work. So it's just good to get a sense of like how a typical Drupal project runs, so that you might know where to fit in and like what's different about it if it's a Drupal one. So maybe you've already used some other platform, but like what do you need to know for a Drupal project about the planning process? So one thing that we like that I would recommend always starting out with, and this probably goes for any kind of project at all, is to kind of start with the discovery phase to figure out what the goals are and why you're actually doing the project. And sometimes it's a good question to ask, like, why do we need a website for this? Why a website? And sometimes these days it's like, well, of course you have to have a website for anybody to take anybody seriously. You need kind of this home base. But really, like, why this website and what's the role of it? And along with that, often the first conversations, I love starting to talk about content. And the more you learn about Drupal, the more you'll learn that content is kind of at the core of everything. You learned about nodes, which are these building blocks of content. Like you create any page or event or anything, it's all pieces of content or nodes. And everything kind of revolves around that, like all the features you're going to add, the users, the roles that you set up. And so when you're planning a project, really having a handle on what is that content and how should it be organized, and what's the more important content, what do we need to prioritize. Just getting a real handle on that is a really important part of any Drupal project. And you have so much flexibility on the Drupal side that really the key is more, and the challenge is more figuring out what the content needs are. And then one thing that I would suggest doing, especially on your first project, is to put aside some time for prototyping. What do I mean by prototyping? So like I said, you know, a lot of the conversations you're going to have about Drupal are going to revolve around, okay, well, what module should I use? I want to create an events calendar. Maybe I'll Google Drupal module events calendar, and I'm going to see some modules, and I'm going to see some tutorials about how to do this. And maybe I have an idea in my head about what it's going to look like. Well, it would be really good for you to set aside a bit of time for yourself, because you're learning Drupal, to like prototype that. So by prototype, I mean try building it, but not like the perfect version, just a minimum viable product, just like a quick, like, can I create events? Can I get something that looks like what I have in my head? And then it'll help you figure out maybe how long it's going to take you to do this, if it's feasible, if there's a module that exists. And maybe in that phase, you're going to be doing this thing where you go to a Drupal event, or you go on Slack and you ask questions like, what, am I doing this right? This is how I was planning it. What do you think? Or you're looking for maybe a blog post that somebody wrote because they shared already how they did this. Or you look at those case studies, and maybe you even find a Drupal website where someone's built out something that looks like you want it to. And maybe you can kind of get a sense of how they did it. So that I would put some pinpoint on. And then of course, it's good to do the design work. You know, Drupal is very flexible on the front end. So usually it's possible with CSS and JavaScript to get things to look the way that you want. But the first time you do it, you'll probably face challenges, right? If that's your role. So just, again, getting a sense of like, how do other people do this with Drupal might help you choose a slightly easier path. And then building, like installing and configuring the modules, like actually the building part is kind of like what we think of as the main work of creating a website. And all the custom modules and themes that can go into that. So that's like the work of coding and configuring, and configuration takes time. Sometimes we just think, oh, there's a module that does this thing, then I get it. It's like an instant feature. But often in Drupal, there's a lot of flexibility. So you imagine there's millions of websites running the same software, but they all have different combinations. Like people have checked different checkboxes, and so things work differently. Well, it's a lot of work to check those checkboxes and fill in all those forms. So make sure you leave time for that too. And then maintenance. So this is an important thing to plan for. Like when your website is finished and you're launching it, there's still work to be done. And it's really important with any software at all to keep it up to date. So with Drupal, there's security updates that come out, and you need to make sure that you have some time set aside in your planning to do those updates. So just a few pieces of advice, and I know I'm speaking to an audience that's quite diverse, so I'm not sure if all of this advice will resonate with you immediately, but just some seeds to plant and things to think about along the way, just more in terms of project planning. So the first point is it's valuable for everyone who's working on your website. If you're working solo, or if you've got a team, or you have just one or two colleagues, or whatever it is, it's important that everybody has some basic understanding of Drupal. So this content that you're getting today about, you know, what is Drupal? How do I get started? Like the terminology, just understanding the lay of the land, that's valuable for everyone, from content editors to designers to, of course, developers. Just so that they know what's possible and like how to what the expectations should be. So if this is the first time your team is working on a Drupal project, just getting everybody up to speed to some degree is valuable. Like I said in the previous slide, leaving time to evaluate modules and prototype things is probably going to save you time in the long run. So don't think about it as wasting time. And one important kind of prerequisite for that is having a sandbox that you can play in. So if today, if maybe you already have a sandbox site set up, even if you have a site set up already, like in your more like work environment, or like that you're using to build an actual project, like that's great too. But having your own sandbox that you can just play in and mess around with and kind of, doesn't matter, like a throwaway environment, that's going to give you more freedom to play and learn. Using features available in Drupal core first. So this is like, there's a tremendous amount that you can build just with what you get out of the box with Drupal. And often it's going to be much easier for you if you use that first before you always go and like download 500 modules or build your own module to do something. So just as a general rule, trying to do as much as you can with Drupal core, then looking to the community for additional modules, then trying to build something that's customized as a last kind of option. That's generally the best way to go. And that just makes it so that you don't have so much work to do in the long run to maintain everything that you're building. And then these last two are slightly more technical. So setting up a development workflow. So what is the development workflow? Development workflow is like, once you've launched your site, you're updating all this content on your site, but you still want to do updates. Like you still want to be able to maybe add a new feature that you forgot to add, or that you got as a feature request, or you want to install a new module. So there's always like improvements that you want to make after you launch. So a development workflow is just the way that you basically make those updates. So you're able to still be updating content on your website, but like kind of slide in a new feature, like, oh, now we also are going to add an events calendar. And there's a lot to say on development workflow, and like there's a lot to learn. And I think it's one of the big challenges of learning Drupal. Like you can go right now and install Drupal and build a whole site just on your laptop. But then going and taking that and putting it into your hosting environment and then keeping it up to date, like that part tends to be a little bit more challenging. So there's training specifically on that topic that you can attend. And I think also, like, depending on how you're using Drupal, there's training maybe more specific to the hosting provider that you're using. And that leads us to our last point, which is investing in the right infrastructure. So back 15 years ago, people were all basically, well, not all, but a lot of people were running websites just on a server that they had in their office, on-premises hosting. Now, these days, kind of the go-to solution is using a cloud hosting. So people think of hosting in Amazon Cloud or other options like that. Now there's really specific hosting providers also that specialize in Drupal. And the advantage of using one of those providers is that they help you with that development workflow part. And they make it a bit easier for you to run updates and keep everything going and everything up to date. So I find working on many different projects that if we're using a Drupal specific hosting provider, it saves us a lot of time. So the big three that I think people always talk about, so we have Acquia, Pantheon, Platform SH, but there are others as well. Do I have time left, Avi? I'm not sure what the schedule is.
Yes, I think you're going to 12:15.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So last few slides and then others. I think there were some questions I'm going to stop. And make sure you can all chat as well. So the last just little section is more about like roles in Drupal. So these slides I've actually put together for a specific scholarship program that's being introduced to get people into Drupal. So that's why it says this program is focused on training for these jobs. But this is actually very applicable, I think, to everyone. So there's often in the Drupal community, I guess, we talk about different roles on Drupal projects. And I mean, these roles are kind of useful in just talking about what people tend to do, but I've personally played all three of these roles kind of on the same project, or I've been on bigger projects where you just do one of the roles. So it really depends on the environment and kind of what your background is, or what you're going to be best maybe adapted to if you're starting out in Drupal. But it can be helpful to think about these as three different kind of skill sets. And so we often talk about site builders, and I think it's kind of a Drupal term, but I don't really know what the alternative term would be. Site builders are usually people who are really focused on getting that configuration part right. So when I was talking about, prototyping functionality, like if you're the one who's actually going in and using things like content types and taxonomy and views and these terms that you probably learned about just an hour ago, learning kind of which are the best modules to use and how to kind of set things up that you're making sure that the content is all in the right place and following the information architecture that you created. That's really a site builder kind of role. So not so much coding, usually not coding, but everything you can do through configuration. But there's so much expertise that you kind of need in that area to build a Drupal site and to really get the most out of Drupal. So site building, like you can just start learning on your own, trying things out. It's quite accessible to get started, but there are a lot of things to learn once you get into the details. Front-end developers are usually focused more on the look and feel of websites. So taking CSS and JavaScript and basically using those with Drupal. So usually front-end developers that I work with also know some Drupal site building so that they can do both. Like, oh, I can set up this event content type, and then I can also make it look like the event of my dreams, like the thing that's in the mock-up. But some people are just more specialized just in the CSS and JavaScript, and it's somebody else doing that site building work. So that's another kind of role. So if you're already a front-end developer, learning the Drupal part, you'll probably get up and running quickly. But the more you know about Drupal, probably the easier it will be for you to be efficient in that work. And I find that people who have experience with WordPress and other CMSs, they can tend to pick up this role of front-end developer quickly because they kind of already understand the concepts of templating. And so it will kind of map to how to do it in the Drupal world. And if you are completely new to the world of content management systems, it would also be helpful for you to start by learning, learning CSS and JavaScript, because that's going to complement how you're going to use them in Drupal. So that's kind of another role on projects, front-end developer. Front-end developers also often get really excited about Node.js and other frameworks. It's also possible to integrate those with Drupal. And then the last role here, typical, is back-end developer. And this is what we think of as like the people who are creating custom modules or extending other Drupal modules that exist and setting up kind of like, oh, we have this website, we built it all out, but we also need to integrate this website with another website, and we need to pull in the content from that website. Those kinds of tasks, that's always a back-end developer. So less about how things are displayed, but more about just getting the content to the right place at the right time, building the functionality, just making sure that all of that is working. And usually backend developers do tend to be the ones to kind of set up development workflows and make sure that security updates are run and things like that. So if you are new to Drupal, getting started with as a backend developer, learning PHP is going to be valuable. Learning some just like programming basics is going to be valuable. Maybe you already know those things, so maybe you've already used them on other platforms and other projects. In which case, there's a lot to still learn about just how Drupal functions, and often it's like a matter of just knowing where do I plug my little bit of code in to get everything to work together. So really understanding that piece is part of being a backend developer. And Drupal's open source, so you can open the code and look at it, which is really, really helps with learning, I find. So this is, I think, very US-centric kind of salary expectations. Again, this is kind of part of this scholarship program. I didn't make this slide, but there is money to be made in the Drupal space. So all of this work investing in learning and how to do things the right way and training and all of that, there are good jobs to be had in the Drupal space, and tends to be a very high demand for Drupal expertise. Okay. Wow, I have this awesome video. I'm going to skip by the video because I want to make sure we have time for some questions. So please ask away.
Thanks, Suzanne. Give me 1 sec. I'm going to allow folks to unmute themselves. Okay. Everybody is able to unmute themselves now. So if you'd like, feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question. Thank you, Susan, for a great presentation. And I like what you mentioned about the scholarship. And I have a question. When a person is not familiar with Drupal per se, but has been a developer and has moved away from being a software developer and wants to get in, where would that person start? What would you recommend?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of, it kind of depends on your learning style. So like I run a Drupal training, program, and we have courses specifically for developers who are getting into Drupal that want to learn the Drupal part. And that's going to take you through, the first step, like the Hello World, building the Hello World Drupal module. Then after that, like learning about, okay, how do we create each of these building blocks in Drupal, like just creating a new page programmatically or creating a new block programmatically, like all of the things that make up a Drupal website, like how does that kind of work behind the scenes? So there's courses that cover that. But if you are looking at it more just like from self-learning point of view, I would recommend going to Drupal events, because there's often these kind of more entry-level presentations that will walk you through that content. And then beyond the Drupal events, basically every Drupal event I've ever been to, every single session is recorded. So if you're looking for that content and you kind of want more of a walkthrough guide in a video format, you can go and look for those videos just about like my first Drupal module, how do I create one? And just getting a feel for that, but really trying it hands-on, like trying to create the module and install it and all of that. I would really recommend the approach that you take when you're learning is to also open up the code a lot. Like, don't shy away from looking at Drupal core code. We have this phrase in the Drupal community, like, don't hack core, like, don't go and edit the core code. And that's good advice, but you can also open it and look at it and see kind of how it works. And once you kind of learn where to look for things, like where are all those modules, what files are in them, it will become more familiar and easier to learn.
Great suggestions. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Mona. And I shared in the Slack too. Suzanne mentioned the videos. Drupal.tv is a great resource for videos, and they've been collecting videos from Drupal camps and events for a couple of years now.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else? Cool. I'm going to ask everybody to unmute. We can give Suzanne a round of applause. And yay.
Yay!
Yay.